Consider a system similar to the function of D&D or its application in real life for those seeking to use a advanced intelligence function where they engage in the activity of actively redacting the majority of the information, where it is slowly revealed systematically by the reactions in the subtext, generating the position of ages-old oppositions and contests and variations and spites. Uh, Completely surprising to the main party who does not currently have it under those redactions, and the reaction around them, such as the auto insert of that position, generates the surprise of the long-lasting history where the person is completely ridiculous for having not known the core identity and thus the action of the centuries old thing that has imbued itself to the core of their being, where they are completely surprised by it. And this actively is generated by the long-standing function of dismantling the person's identity and thus the mechanism of identity on the basis of the support network system of their communities. And the deal with the devil actively having infiltrated each of them has given them the position where they would forfeit all of their advantages in favor of whatever trinket the devil would provide to them, no matter how great or how benign, and thus the action of their interest, such as their betrayal in envy and small-mindedness or greed, and thus the action of them pursuing their superiority on that function, actively betray their greater value and collapse the structure, and thus the action of them not knowing why it is important for that union to exist actively play into the redaction of the primary party, and thus the action has the system turn against the party, and thus the community that would have to be protected by the party is actively acting in contradiction to the primary party, which then maintains the position of destroying their soul in order to fight the party, which has to be protected by the party, in these types of topsy-turvy little relationships. And thus the long-standing functions of their claims, of their core beliefs, of their biases before the function of their defamation, and thus the action of their defamation, having been widely varieties on the basis of whatever random thing that they come up with as a personal interest or fake justification, or having been sold an illusion, generates fake positions. And thus the argument for them, having participated in the deal with the devil, is to engage in gross negligence at the very best, and thus the action always includes them knowing better. And thus the fact that they know better, but are just unwilling to look in the place that they know where to look in order to dismiss it, no longer qualifies it as a functional claim. And thus the defamation is never a claim, and thus the action of the original belief about the structure that they're living with, as they are not redacted from that core thing that has to be investigated by the party in order to save them from the threats, including the devils they sold their soul to, becomes the exponential tragedy. And thus this compounds to its most realistic confusion and improv session, similar to the function of those who go to school and have the class improv, and this being expressed through the communications of the secret intelligence function, such as the use of microwaves, which is just advanced light, which then generates the position of their mind control or tapping into their nerves and mind, similar to the function of the ones that you put on a silly hat and it sends out the light and it reads the brain signals. And thus the action of that, but just at a larger distance, generates the function of the amplification of the range by using the microwaves, being able to pierce uh, property, glass, metal, walls, wood, whatever. And so the function is non-avoidable. And to this extent, you have this perpetual function where they're engaging in this action. And the function of the actual confession is in their avoiding of the subject, primarily investigating it by their denial of its reality. And thus the function of they know it, and that's why they're not looking into it, becomes the primary mechanism in order to solve the puzzle, which includes the function of their retaliations. And these retaliations aren't directly violent all of the time. Some of the time, it's just setting them up with a conversation under an abuse theater so the person will be embarrassed in front of other people that would have otherwise been important to them, uh, getting the social dynamic of these snide subversions. Persons too charming, actively being subverted, the difficulties and subversions off screen not seen by the other party is then exponentially compounded by these functions until the person's charisma is reduced, wisdom is reduced, intelligence is reduced, etc. And thus the action of them defaulting into an abuse theater generates the position of them looking more and more ridiculous, and thus the function of modifying how they look to the other party until the other party no longer wants to participate and begins to retaliate out of disgust of whatever gimmick they have manipulated. And thus the function of them perpetually feeling that they are dealing with someone beneath their status or something along these lines generates whatever gimmick is naturally reflectant of the abuser who was casting the spell, and thus the action of them using the person's image in order to do it to themselves so that the rapist can become more and more effective, which actively is the foundation of the function. And then at the points that the person gives into it, then the rapists are actively able to take advantage of this and extort it for their own good. And thus the function of failing is defamation, and the success is adding to the data pile from the metadata in order to make more effective criminals who are in control of the equipment. But this can be subverted if the party can convince the other party, who is supposed to be watching the defamation campaign, to kind of polite their way into the thing where they solve the various puzzles and thus dissolve the illusion, allowing them to have a real conversation and potentially to get rid of the stupid little brat who's being an insufferable a-hole. Because retaliation, because base reality. Shocked at having been able to discern it, actively has to encourage this retaliation. Now, the function of this actively going into the childish do they like each other game of, whatever school kids you want to think of, where the girls are actively giggling in the side about liking the guys, and the guys are giggling in the side and acting macho, and thus the actual representation of them getting close to each other is then over amplified into the function of whatever nonsense as they communicate it back to their groups respectively, and thus this actively encourages itself as an aspect of the manipulation, as many of them who would have co-signed these types of programs are emotionally 11, and thus the action of them having actively trained themselves in order to gain the position under their ability to have generated efforts would, by definition, have normalized to the common denominator of their emotional state, and thus the action of great power under the juvenile influence of that base loyalty has generated the function, which often leads to the retaliations on the basis of that emotional security. and to the extent that they are not able to hold up to the higher levels of that function, would actively act benignly towards the good and maliciously, and thus the action, having compromised itself, only reveals it from the mask that they provide as a persona, and thus the action of each pursuing to the deeper levels facilitates the function of their greater and greater juvenile behavior. And to this extent, the function of them knowing better and then denying it turns into these childish games, turns into these girl games. So whenever you're having a girl who is trying to shit test or something along these lines, a guy, it's often what they're going to be doing as a functional defense mechanism as they subvert and juke their way out of the conversation and seek to replace it with the illusion which they blatantly know is fraud and is nowhere close to an actual legitimate claim, although they might seek to defraud the courts or records or government, as their contempt for the government, such as the Congress, is palpable, selling it and everyone in that country to its enemies as a core facet of their base corruption, such as when you return to the function of the deal with the devil and whatever arbitrary trinket it provided. And thus the function of speaking with increasingly more important people becomes the function of understanding the base identities of that core group of people, such as the politicians, such as judges, such as the function of actors or bosses, employees, etc., 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 so on and so forth. And thus the function of understanding the core identities under the basis of this active revelation by the censorship materializes the function of the more core reality of who and what they are, and thus the action of categorizing them effectively materializes the action of who they are in relation to that subversion and their deal with the devil, and thus the action of who you would actually prefer to be around socially outside of the context of the disdain from the separation of classes, etc., is revealed by these base characteristics, which is then modeled and subverted actively by various functions such as needs and requirements, and thus the action of you needing to accomplish a mission which requires the material components of another group, etc., 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 then materializes the function of the cetera in the function of each having conducted the progress of each of the quests, and to this extent the function having revealed itself from the various mechanisms available materializes the function of the objective of the devils, which is the redactions, which then functionally removes the capability of people to discern how to protect themselves, and thus the action of them being responsible for the removal of their own security by their subversion under the redaction, using the cloak, pretending that it's a strength, which is the thing that is killing. Specific example, make a reference of people who are actively being poisoned. Let's say it's a government function that has created a nuclear disaster. And then the function of the nuclear disaster is actively poisoning, deforming their children. Thus, the function of their use of the disguise creates the distortion for the extortion, which is then rejected, which then makes them responsible for having been poisoned because the way of escape was provided, which they rejected it in order to do the extortion outside of the normal function of actually acquiring the legitimate activities, and thus the use of the disguise and an extortion advantage is the being used is the reason that they're getting poisoned, and thus the action requires them to grow up and not use the extortion and admit to the base reality. And the action of having admitted to the base reality allows them to assert the actual material claim that they want. But they, seeking the function of using it for the resale purpose, purpose, deluded under that position for the extortion because they're given the advantage to have that superior power over the party or other groups, and thus the action requires them to forfeit that thing in order to not extort the product, which is then no longer being poisoned, etc., etc., etc. And thus the materialization of them devolving under that situation requires them to have only had a slight opportunity as the function's complications to failure, as the devils would actively see their capability of doing that, requiring them to grow up earlier and earlier and earlier in order to have materially solved the problem without it materializing into being their fault, and thus contract to the alternative function, which has certified that they have passed all of the checkpoints or failed all of the checkpoints, which then would materialize the funding of them being removed from the poison or cured, etc., or having failed to receive it, and thus the action of them having failed to pass this arbitrary test then materializes the function from the devils to withhold the funding from those that have made the contract with the devils themselves inside of the government, which you had to have talked to in order to have dissolved the issue, as they're actively distracted and given false hopes in every various function, until they have admitted to the base reality from their core claims, where the primary party has to be given its mechanisms necessary for the progress in order for them to have received that benefit which they are reluctant to provide because of their enemy's complication. That makes it their fault, which is actively being viewed under the D&D rules of counter devils, which I will call them Irendes, and thus the action of the Irendes materializes the function of challenging their legal claim under the devil's arrangement, which then facilitates the activity of whenever the person had been given too many complications or the devil has sought to cheat, which by definition includes the function of their underlings, of those who have made the deals with them, who are actively doing the support structure for that con job, which the devil itself wishes to ignore, and the function of having the counter arguments under those devilish contracts facilitates the activity of a fake legitimacy, which would actively be subverted as any of the challenges would actively become fatal to their objective, eking the devils closer and closer to the demonic, as the function of their breaking of law is fundamental to the chaos, which is fundamental to the demons, which, by definition, is a renouncing of their devilish position, which is no longer the function of being cute or snide or subversive or witty, in favor of smash the Beatles. Smash them. Smash the Beatles. Smash the Beatles! Smash the Beatles! Devolving exponentially for every single violation, which reveals their core identity as having disguised themselves as something else entirely, but in reality the function of their core alignment, having actively devolved by these degeneracies, materializes the function of the demonic acquiring the function of insurgencies inside of hell, which no longer serve the activity of hell, as the insurgency inside of hell makes the strength of the devil its weakness, and thus the strength of those that it is providing deals for is the weakness of the person taking the deal. And the active subversion of these contracts actively creates the division of the legal agreement of the people who are betraying their oaths, and thus the action and turns into the Lord of the Rings, I believe it was Return of the King, where the steward says that you'll use with one hand me as a shield, and with the other hand you will cut me in the back with a sword, and thus the act of betraying it. But the function proves the action of the supplanting, which is not a supplanting, as the authority rests in the function of the one that they are supplanting, as the steward ignoring the authority of their superior, which they seek to deny out of jealousy and malice, and thus to this end facilitate the function of having solely materialized as guilt in the failure of the contract, as the deal with the devil, having proven the soul inferior and subject to evil. But it is in this action, not the authority of that steward or any other, especially in real life, in the real world, in these United States, to deny the pursuit and seeking of the remedy to the government in this matter between the insurrectionist Confederacy and David Bowles, and thus the action requires the compulsion of Congress to recognize David's obstructed title and to deny the thing that is not their authority to deny in the acknowledgement of this, forcing the duel and the appropriate resources necessary to have conducted it, such as time without the disturbance. Having acknowledged the obstructed title's value has to facilitates that function, and the action of it having a challenger from the Confederacy, which has actively sought to gut it, materializes the function of the duel having to prove that Congress has to support the Americans before it can be returned, and thus these inconveniences aside, does not change the fact that Congress has to acknowledge the title and the things that are owed to it, and thus in the releasing of that function facilitates those who are actually loyal to the function of order and to its law, in order to have facilitated the restoration of the capabilities to contract, amongst others, in order to have generated the necessary resources in the action to have reported accurately to Congress its responsibilities and definitions. And thus David Bowles must be fully restored in this action. He must be summoned to D.C. to report this to Congress, which then materially has, having certified the recognition of the obstructed values, which they do not have authority to change status for, or to have committed the obstructions of the contracts, including the foundational educational contracts, which is the objective of the war insurrectionists by the Confederacy, which being the other side, has conducted these actions, which, having done so, can only acquire the remedy of its restoration, which is different to the acknowledgement of the title of the owed progress by the obstruction of the contract schedule. And the contract schedule is the title, and thus the action of the material goods is separate to these requirements, which they have no authority to refuse, which would prove in that confession David's intelligence oversight role, as it was necessary under David's status to be able to make the vote forming the Senate and actively being a high function in the investment of PACs and other functions in order to fund those who are voting for Congress or seeking the position, actively conducting propaganda campaigns in order to finance people's support for them to be able to be voted in and certified as Congress. Thus, the action of the Confederacy would lose outright if David was not given the position of intelligence oversight, forcing him to become apolitical and automating the function of the power brokerage. And thus, the action of them being guilty of high treason is derived by the function of them having made these attacks by the bill of attainder and ex post facto, and thus the action of these high treasons must be materialized, and thus the action of their reaction to this function materializes the function of the intelligence oversight function, which, if David Bowles would have been able to have acquired without the obstruction, would have built for himself either way, as the function of him being the head of his political party would then dissolve into a platform, which then he would ascend from, making himself that position, giving him access to all of the secrets for this material good, and thus the action would have David be the intelligence oversight six-star general from their estimate in either case, and thus the action of delaying it by the function requires them to make the investment ahead of time, and thus the best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago. They, in their perception of the future, had to make criminal intentions in those subversions, and the legal subversion required them to make the action, and the criminal subversion is high treason, as they are the living incorporation of infamy. And those loyal to the Confederacy inside of the military and intelligence agencies will refuse to work for David, and in this action, having revealed themselves as a traitor to these United States, would actively conduct the necessary obstructions in order for the Americans to permanently fail, at which point it is self-revealing, and to the extent that it does so, it is what it is, and in the realization manifests itself towards their core loyalties, which includes the function of them actively denying access to the essential actions, materials, and resources, etc., 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 and thus the action of withholding base information from presidents, which they wish to ascend to the function of kings, is then denied readily, according to the system, if they are disloyal to the Confederacy, which means checks and balances do not form in the hands of the Americans, but exclusively the white supremacist Soviet.